Alright, so I downloaded a bunch of samples that have nothing to do with each other, and today I'm going to be making a beat from start to finish. Alright, so let's take a listen to what I downloaded here. So as you guys can hear, it's a bunch of different loops that have a bunch of different instruments playing in them. Now what I'm going to do first off is try to figure out which one of these samples I want to use to be the foundation of my beat. And from the sounds of it, I think sample 1 is going to work best. Now there's a few different reasons why I think sample 1 is going to be the best one. Now one of the reasons why is because it's a simple 2-chord progression you guys can hear are all the exact same chord, and these 8 chops here are a different chord. So that's one benefit. I sort of have a stable foundation here for at least a 2-note progression for my basic loop. And you guys can hear as well the melody that's playing on top throughout this entire sample. I have a lot going on with the melody. It's not as if it's playing the exact same notes over and over again. And for those reasons, that's exactly why this loop is going to be my starting point. It provides a good foundation because it has those stable chords underneath, but it has enough variation on top with the melody, and it's going to provide me a lot of material with the different chops here to keep it interesting. So now I'm going to bring the BPM down to around 73. I'm just going to randomize a bunch of these notes here and just start playing around. So after playing around for a bit, I found this 2-chop progression here. So now what I want to do is find another 2 chops in the sample that's going to help me make a longer loop instead of just this 2-note loop here. Now hopefully you guys are starting to see why I chose this sample. Again, it's only a 2-chord progression in the sample, and so this lets me more easily play around with the different chops in here and not have to worry about certain chops not working with the other ones. Again, the first 4 chops here were the exact same chord, and these chops over here were the exact same chord. So I know right off the bat these chops are going to work with one another, so I can just play around with the different pitches and it still sounds fluid. So I'm going to make a small adjustment here to this chop. I want to make it a little bit longer here. And I also want to play around with the pitch of the sample overall. So I'm going to bring it up a bit, see how that sounds. So that's sounding pretty good to me. I'm going to use this as my main loop here. So I'm going to play around with the sample a tiny bit. Let's see what else I can do with it. So this reverse effect sounds pretty cool, but I might just save this for a switch up or something later on. I sort of like the sample as it is. So again, let's hear how the sample sounded at first. Now what we have is this. I just took the sample, played around with the different sections of it, pitched it around a little bit, and came up with a very stable foundation for the beat here. Now what I'm going to do is add some effects on top of this sample, just so it's a little bit more audible here. So I'm going to start off by adding some bit crusher. I'm going to add some EQ on top now, just to reduce some of that really high-end hissing noise. I'm going to bump up some of the mid-range here a tiny bit as well. I'm going to add a tiny bit of saturation as well, just to bring a little bit more presence to the mid-range again. And finally, a little bit of reverb on top of this sample, just so it takes up more room in the beat. So again, this is how the loop sounded without these effects. And with the effects, It's just a little bit more audible now that I added these effects on top. Next up, let's focus in on drums now. So I'm gonna go into my drum sounds here. So if you guys have watched any of my older videos, what I do whenever I start a beat is I start off with a very basic framework for a drum pattern. Again, this drum pattern is a sort of fundamental to hip hop beats. You have a kick on the 1 and a snare on the 2 and the 4. So it's just a good place to start off. Now the kick that I have here, it sounds pretty good, but I want to play around with the snare a bit more here. I'm going to start off with some tape saturation. Next up, I'll add some camel crusher. Now the snare is sounding really dense, so one of the things that I like to do in this type of situation, I'll go into the sample here and I'll cut off the sample start. I'm also going to play around with the pitch a tiny bit. So far so good with this drum pattern. I'm going to fill out the kick pattern a little bit more. Lastly, I'm going to add some hi-hats here. I'm going to do the exact same thing with this hi-hat. It's feeling a bit too intrusive here. Now you guys will notice when I look at this hi-hat pattern, it seems pretty basic. The reason why is because later on, if I plan on adding more samples to make this beat a little bit more dense, I sort of want to make sure that the other elements in the beat are a little bit more minimal just to make some room for them. If I get super crazy with my drums now in the beginning of the process and I make all sorts of fills and rolls, I'm going to have a lot less room for the samples later on. For now, I'm going to add a second layer of hi-hats here. Alright, all that's left is my 808 pattern. Once again, I don't want to clutter my beat, so I'm going to keep it pretty simple here. So I have my basic framework here for my drum pattern. Now I'm going to move on to adding more samples to the beat. For the next sample, I sort of want to think about what's missing in the beat right now. I don't really need this sample. I already have keys in my beat. The loop that I already came up with, it already has a lot going on in the mid-range here, so I don't need my second sample that I'm going to play around with here to be the exact same type of sample that has the exact same frequency range. And I don't need my next sample to take up a lot of the low end just because I already have an 808 here, so I need something else. So this sample seems to fit the bill. It has a little bit more going on in the high end. So this is going to be pretty good for a supplemental type of sound for my beat here. So I'm going to just drag the sample in directly into FL Studio. My interest with the sample isn't necessarily to chop it up and create an entirely different arrangement here. So right off the bat, I'm going to go in and EQ a lot of the frequencies that I don't need out. Again, my main loop is taking care of a lot of the mid-range, so let's cut out a lot of the mid-range of this sample. I'm going to cut some of the high end out as well, just because I want to control it a little bit more. I'm going to turn on the envelope in the sample as well, just again so I can control it more. And at this point, I'm just going to start combing through the sample to see what sounds good. Another thing that I like to do is play around with different pitches as well. So when I played this sample at an octave lower, I sort of like the sound that it produced. I'm going to go into the EQ again and boost some more of the frequencies that I like of that sample. I'm going to add some reverb just to throw the sound into the back a tiny bit. So I like the sound. I'm going to keep it in the beat, but I don't think it's going to be as good for the main section of the beat. This is more valuable for a bridge or a hook, so I'm just going to mute it for now. But again, let's hear how the sample first sounded. And what I turned it into here. So you don't necessarily have to treat your samples as if you're chopping up the different instruments to create a new progression or anything. What I like to do is sort of pull apart the samples and really stretch them out and play with the pitches just to add more texture onto the beat. All right, so for now, what I'm gonna do is duplicate the sample and try to look for something else in here. So this section of the sample sort of sounds good to me if I were to use it as a stab in the beat, just at the beginning of the loop, for example. So what I'm gonna do is add some more effects on top, but I'm gonna put it to its own insert here. I'm gonna duplicate what I have already in the insert here, bring it to the new one, just so I can add some separate effects onto this. Play around with the EQ of this sound a little bit more, open it up a tiny bit. I'm going to turn the mix up on the reverb just to push it back in the beat a little bit more. I'm also going to add some delay onto this sound as well. So I got the idea here to play the stab at a high octave in the first bar here, and then at the third bar I'm going to play it at an octave lower. This is going to help add some more variation into the beat. Now at this point, I'm going to add some more sounds into the beat. So I'm going to try to take this sample here and see what I can do with it. So a little trick for you guys, one of the things that I actually like to do is take my sample and I sort of like to slowly comb through the different mixer inserts that I already have pre-made. It's just a quick little way of experimenting with different types of effects that you might not have thought of. So when I put it to insert 3, this sort of sounds cool to me here. So what I'm going to do is put this to its own insert and copy over insert 3's effects into the new one here. And now I'm going to do some further experimenting. So I came up with this loop here. It fits with the beat, but it doesn't sound all that great, to be honest. I'm gonna see if I can shape it to fit the beat a little bit more. So I added Shaper Box onto this loop, and I chose this preset here called Stutter 3. It sounds pretty cool to me. At this point, I want the sound to be a little bit more large, so I'm going to add some delay on top. I'm going to add some flanger on top as well. Again, this is how the sample originally sounded. And all I really did was I took one of those guitar licks that you guys heard, and I just made this pattern with it, and I did some pretty heavy experimentation to the sound, and this was the end result here. So again, when it comes to samples, people might have this straightforward way of looking at it, where all you can do is just chop up samples, rearrange them, and that's it. But you can get very experimental with them and come up with some really original textures that you might not have thought of if you just had a traditional synth that you're trying to work with. I think a good idea would be if I combine this sound with my original sound up here. I can basically use these two samples for a hook section in my beat. Now what I'm going to do is complicate this drum pattern a little bit more, like I mentioned. So I added these small little percussion noises in my beat just to fill out the beat a little bit more. With the hi-hats, I added a little bit more complexity with these rolls here. I also played notes at different pitches. And again, the reason why I saved this until the end is because I wanted to make sure I had enough room for whatever samples that I'm adding here. Alright, so now I'm going to arrange the beat out. What I'm going to start off by doing is go into the pattern section here, split by channel. And now I'm going to go ahead and drag these all into my playlist here. I'm just going to create a basic framework to start off with. I'm going to have a 16-bar verse and then an 8-bar hook. If you guys remember, what I want to do is take these samples here and save them for my hook section. So I'll go ahead and remove them from the verse section in the first 16 bars here. Now the first thing I want to focus on is how to get from my verse section into my hook section a little bit more fluidly. You guys can hear right now. It doesn't sound too bad right now. It's not completely jarring, but I'm going to do what I can to make it a little bit more fluid nonetheless. One of the common techniques that I like to do is to take one of the elements in the hook section, introduce it a little bit early here. So I'm going to go ahead and automate the volume for the sound here. So you guys can see I slowly introduce the sound at the end of the verse section into the hook section with the automation that I created here. I made a video a while back on how you can use automation like this to improve your beat structure, so check that video out if that's something that you're interested in. Another thing that I like to do is to drop drum patterns at the end of specific areas in the beat. So I'm going to drop some of the drums here. I also added this transition sound, again, just to help the transition between each of these different sections. I can also take my main loop and sort of play around with the different notes that I have here. Again, one of the benefits of using the sample that has these same chords playing over and over again, I have enough material here where I can choose different chops that sound different enough to be interesting in different parts of the beats, but similar enough where they still work with each other. So now this transition just sounds a lot better to me. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and double this entire thing, just so I have a verse hook type of structure to the beat. But I also want to add a bridge into this section here. So I'm going to move this over 8 bars. Now if you guys remember originally when I was playing around with the sample, when I reversed it, it sounded pretty cool to me. So that is an idea I'm going to play with here. So I'll drag in my loop. I'll make this unique as well. And I went ahead and I cloned my sample here. So I'm going to open this up and turn on reverse. Now I'm going to shift the pattern around to come up with something a little bit more interesting. So I'll use this pattern from my bridge here. I'm going to do the exact same thing with my 808 pattern here. Again, I'm going to make it unique and try to come up with something a little bit different. I can do the exact same thing with different layers in my drums as well. Now instead of creating an alternate pattern with my snare, what I'm going to do is choose an entirely new snare here. So at this point, my pattern and my textures here are pretty different from my original loop, so it might not be as fluid when I try to get back into the verse section here. As a pretty jarring transition there. So I'm going to do the exact same process as I did before. I'm going to introduce some of these sounds that I want back early. That just sounds a lot more fluid to me. Alright, at this point I have the basic framework of my beat done. I'm going to add an intro and an outro as well. Again, I'm just going to keep it very simple just for the sake of this video. One of the things that I like to do to create an easy outro is just slowly remove some of the layers from my hook. That works for now. I might add some variation to this later on. And again, same concept with an intro. I can just slowly introduce textures into the beat. Now what I'm going to do is just focus in on these smaller details just to get this beat sounding a little bit more interesting. Alright, so here is the finished product. Some of the things that I did was I added this filter onto the intro and I slowly peeled it back. I made a bunch of drum rolls here as well. In the bridge section, I also added this layer of percussion on top just to fill it out a little bit more. I I also added this piano melody at the second half of the bridge as well. And for the second half of the second verse, I made a switch up with a sample loop. I used this exact same pattern at the very end of the beat just for the outro as well. Now, if creating these types of switch ups and variation in your beat is something that you struggle with, I'd highly recommend watching my videos on the 5 fundamentals of beat arrangement. That's something that's really going to help you out and help you understand some of the different possibilities when you're trying to come up with your switch ups and make a more interesting arrangement for your beat. At this point, I'd probably go ahead and mix the beat a little bit more just to have these sounds a little bit more cleaner, but you guys get the idea. Hopefully you guys were able to see how I took a bunch of different samples and I was able to manipulate them in a bunch of different ways to make this beat here. If you guys have learned something in this video, please do like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. Let me know if you have some techniques for sampling that you'd like to share. As always, my free drum kit is available in the description box below, and I will see you guys next Tuesday.